Michael Popok, Legal AF. Florida continues its assault on voting registration and voting rights, trying to suppress the vote among minorities, black and brown citizens with the right to vote constitutionally in Florida. And the Department of Justice has had it, and they filed now their second lawsuit and their second attempt to intervene in the case to bring the full weight and power of the Department of Justice in favor of voting rights and voting registration. What am I talking about? There's a new case in Florida that's sitting before a very right-wing MAGA Trump-appointed judge, Judge Alan Windsor, in which the administration for Ron DeSantis and its Secretary of State, Corey Byrd, are trying to impose a rule that a person registering for the vote can only do it with a pen and a wet signature. Sounds innocent, but it actually, based on statistics, lowers and suppresses vote among black and brown and minorities in Florida and other places by a substantial amount. Could be hundreds of thousands of people. And of course, in a state like Florida, that could mean the difference between life and death and the way the vote goes there. And so all we can do as Florida continues to jack up the wall in front of voters, making them leap over increasingly taller barriers, is that the Department of Justice comes in with a sledgehammer and tries to knock that set of barriers down. And it doesn't bode well for the Republican Party, I'll tell you that, and Ron DeSantis, that they haven't been able yet to convince Judge Alan Windsor, no more right-wing ideologue when it comes to voter suppression, is sitting on the bench in America than Alan Windsor. Okay, and as of right now, they can't convince him that that law is appropriate and constitutional and valid under the Federal Voting Rights Act. In fact, because they're cowards, the state of Florida, led by one, they want to try to bar the Department of Justice from intervening in the case. They were fine with the Republican National Committee to come into the case on their behalf, but they didn't want a fair fight and the Department of Justice to come in on behalf of the American people and on behalf of the NAACP, which is the lead plaintiff in the case, along with other voting registration groups. Now, look, they got a powerhouse attorney on the side of the plaintiff, which is a good thing, Mark Elias. But I think it's a fairer fight. Wouldn't you all agree to have the Republican National Committee met in the ring by the Department of Justice and not just by the NAACP, with all the lawyers and briefing and precedent that they can bring to bear? And so when the Department of Justice said, we are the United States of America, as only the Department of Justice can say, and we have an interest in the outcome of this case, and here's our brief to support the main issue in the case right now, which is, do these voting rights groups, do these advocacy groups have standing to allow them to bring the case in their own name on behalf of the general public? Yes or no? And there's a body of law that supports that. And the Department of Justice, of course, and their brilliant appellate and other scholars, voting rights scholars, they have a whole division devoted to voting rights, wants to file their brief. Florida, scared you know what, said, no, we don't want them. Just because they want to come into a case, you shouldn't allow them to, as if there's some sort of drive-by entity that has no relationship to voting rights or constitutional rights in our federal system. They are the defender of those rights. And so, but they thought they had an ace in the hole. And the ace in the hole was Judge Alan Windsor, who was he's 45. He was appointed after spending 5 years as the Solicitor General, which is the top level attorney defending the policies of the governor, whoever the governor is at the time in the state. In this case, it was Governor Scott. And if you think DeSantis was bad in voter suppression and registration, Scott started it. And this judge, Alan Windsor, let me just give you a rundown of some of the cases that he defended, mainly successfully, that were the policies of his boss, Governor Scott. In the Florida NAACP, the same exact parties here in the case I'm describing versus Browning, he defended no match, no vote, which again sounds innocent. All these things sound innocent. That if you didn't have a social security card and a driver's license that match your voter registration card exactly, including your middle initial and whatever, you weren't going to be able to vote. There's statistics that showed that at least 100,000 voters who have a right to vote in Florida, including 75,000 Haitian Americans, were not able to vote because of that particular law. He defended that law, this judge, when he was Solicitor General. He defended, in a case called League of Women Voters versus Cody, he defended huge fines for the late submission of paperwork by voter registration groups who are grassroots and barely have enough money to keep their lights on, and he's going to overfine them in order to discourage them from doing their job, right? And then finally, he was a major supporter, defender in Diaz versus Cobb of having a 29-day box that locks out people from registering to vote less than 29 days from the vote in Florida. Why? Why can't people register to vote a week before? He made it 29 days because, of course, Black, brown, minorities, and others sometimes don't get around to registering, or outreach programs don't reach them in time to have them register so they can exercise their constitutional right to vote. You see the pattern here? So if you can't get Alan Windsor, Mr. Voter Suppression, Mr. Voter Registration Suppression, you can't get him to side with you, you got problems. And right now, Windsor said, I'm going to let the Department of Justice take a swing here. They can get into the ring. They can file their brief. And they can be opposed by the Republican National Committee. That's an equal fight. That's a fair fight. And then I'll let you know my ruling. Now, this is not the only case that the Department of Justice has intervened in. There is another one you might have heard of. It's in the same courthouse, but different judge. And that one deals with third-party voter registration groups, 3P VROs. And the attack on them is that DeSantis has laws on the books that would have required only citizens be able to register people to vote. So if you're a resident alien, you're not allowed to have that job? Why? What was the connection between that and voter fraud? Only all green card holders commit fraud in this country. And also a requirement, in addition to that, that there be no retention of voter data by these voter registration groups. And they're like, well, how are we supposed to activate the vote? How are we supposed to make sure people vote if we don't have their addresses and remind them and get them to the polls, get the souls to the polls? And so the judge, not this particular judge, another judge sitting in the same courthouse, said, you know what, I'm going to stop these two aspects of the bill from being enforced. And I'm going to say you can't stop non-citizens from having the job of voter registration. And I'm going to say they get to keep their information on file so they can also do the other part of community outreach and voter outreach, which is to get people to vote. Registration is one thing, voting is another. And so that's also going on. That's also going on in Florida with the Department of Justice. And just as a side note, for those that follow this thing closely, Alan Windsor, the judge that I just did a long overview about, who's handling this case up in Tallahassee, Florida. The reason we're constantly in the northern district of Florida is because that's where the governor mansion is. That's where the seat of government is for the state of Florida, up in Tallahassee. And when you got a problem with one of those laws, you run into court in Tallahassee. It's got an Obama appointee up there. It's got a Trump appointee up there. Depends on who you get, so to speak. Windsor, the judge I just described, he's also the judge that's been assigned the DeSantis Florida versus Disney case. So we're going to have to see how he comes out on that one. I'll follow everything about Judge Windsor here, only on the MeidasTouch Network, on YouTube, on hot takes just like this one, where I sit at that corner of law and politics. I do it about every day, pull it all together in a weekly podcast, actually twice weekly, Wednesdays and Saturdays. We call it Legal AF. You knew that. You watch me on that show. And then you can follow these kind of hot takes on the MeidasTouch YouTube channel. Free subscribe, free download on an audio, listen to it on an audio platform on all the podcasts. You can find me, Michael Popok, really easily. Go over to the MeidasTouch YouTube channel, go over to the tab that says playlist and contributors, and you'll find me there. And you'll find my entire library of hot takes and analysis in real time that you can follow. If you like what I'm doing, follow me on all things social media at MS Popok, including on Threads. This is Michael Popok, Legal AF reporting.
Hey, Meidas Mighty. Love this report? Continue the conversation by following us on Instagram at MeidasTouch to keep up with the most important news of the day. What are you waiting for? Follow us now.